Most people spend their lives chasing goals without ever questioning the structure underneath those goals. They focus on outcomes, the job title, the income number, the physical transformation, the perfect routine, believing that once those things are achieved, everything will finally settle into place. But life doesn't work that way for long. Achievements are temporary by nature. What quietly determines the direction of your life is not what you aim for, but what you repeatedly do. And what you repeatedly do is governed by the systems you build, consciously or unconsciously. If you look closely, every stable area of a person's life is supported by an invisible structure. Someone who appears disciplined doesn't rely on bursts of motivation. They rely on a system that removes the need to negotiate with themselves every day. Someone who manages money well isn't constantly making heroic financial decisions. They have a system that automatically channels their behavior in the right direction. Even creativity, which seems spontaneous, often rests on a predictable framework that allows ideas to emerge consistently. The idea is simple, but its implications are profound. You don't rise to the level of your ambitions, you fall to the level of your systems. When things are going well, goals feel powerful. When things are uncertain or stressful, systems are what keep you steady. They act like guardrails, gently keeping you on track even when your energy is low or your emotions are scattered. A system for life begins with clarity, but not the kind most people chase. It's not about having a perfectly defined vision of the future. It's about understanding what matters enough to deserve repetition. Because anything you decide to repeat becomes part of your identity over time. If you repeatedly choose distraction, your life slowly organizes itself around distraction. If you repeatedly choose focus, even in small ways, your life begins to reflect depth and direction. There's a quiet shift that happens when you stop asking, "What do I want to achieve?" and start asking, "What kind of person would naturally produce that outcome?" That question changes everything. It moves you away from short-term thinking and into identity-based thinking. Instead of chasing results directly, you begin to build a structure that makes those results almost inevitable. This is where most people struggle, because systems are not exciting in the beginning. They are repetitive, often invisible, and they don't provide immediate rewards. The first few days or even weeks of following a system can feel like nothing is happening. But that's because systems operate on a delay. They accumulate quietly, like compound interest. And then, at some point, the results begin to show up all at once, making it seem like progress happened overnight. A strong life system also removes friction wherever possible. It understands that willpower is unreliable and designs around that fact. If something is important, the system makes it easier to do and harder to avoid. For example, instead of relying on motivation to work out, the system might include preparing your environment in advance, setting a fixed time, and reducing decisions to a minimum. The less thinking required in the moment, the more consistent your behavior becomes. Another important element is feedback. A good system doesn't just run blindly, it adapts. It pays attention to what's working and what isn't, and it adjusts accordingly. This doesn't require constant analysis, but it does require awareness. Without feedback, even the most well-designed system can become rigid and ineffective over time. There's also an emotional component that often gets ignored. Systems are not just mechanical structures, they interact with your state of mind. If your system feels like a punishment, you'll eventually resist it. But if it feels aligned with who you want to be, it becomes easier to maintain. This is why forcing yourself into someone else's routine rarely works for long. A system has to fit your life, your energy, and your priorities. What makes this approach powerful is that it shifts your focus away from outcomes you can't fully control and toward actions you can. You can't control when success arrives, but you can control whether you show up today. You can't guarantee a specific result, but you can build a structure that increases the probability of that result over time. And slowly, almost without noticing, your life begins to change direction. Not because of a single dramatic decision, but because of small, consistent actions that compound. The system starts doing the heavy lifting. It carries you forward even on days when you don't feel like moving. But there's a deeper layer to this idea, one that most people planned, because sooner or later, life will disrupt your routines. Unexpected events will challenge your structure. And in those moments, the real strength of your system will be revealed. The question then becomes, how do you build something that doesn't collapse under pressure, but instead adapts and grows stronger? At some point, you begin to notice that not all systems are created equal. Some look good on paper but quietly fall apart when life becomes unpredictable. Others seem simple, almost unremarkable, yet they hold steady even in chaos. The difference lies in how well a system accounts for reality, not the ideal version of life, but the messy, inconsistent, emotionally charged version we actually live in. A fragile system depends heavily on perfect conditions. It assumes you will always have time, energy, clarity, and motivation. It expects your environment to cooperate and your emotions to stay stable. But life rarely offers that kind of consistency. There are days when you feel sharp and focused, and days when even small tasks feel heavy. If your system only works on your best days, it isn't really a system, it's a temporary arrangement. A resilient system, on the other hand, is built with flexibility at its core. It doesn't break when things go wrong, it bends. It allows for variation without losing direction. Instead of demanding perfection, it encourages continuity. This means that even on your worst days, the system still functions in a reduced but meaningful way. The goal is not to maintain intensity, but to maintain connection. This is where the idea of minimum standards becomes powerful. Rather than setting expectations based on your peak performance, you define a baseline that you can meet even when you're tired, distracted, or overwhelmed. It might not feel impressive, but it keeps the chain unbroken. And over time, consistency at a lower level often outperforms occasional bursts of high effort followed by long gaps of inactivity. There's also something deeper happening beneath the surface. When you continue to show up, even in a small way, you reinforce a sense of identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who doesn't stop, even when things are difficult. That identity becomes a quiet source of strength. It doesn't rely on motivation because it's rooted in who you believe you are. Another important layer is how your system handles failure. Most people treat failure as a signal to stop or to start over completely, but a well-designed system treats failure as information. It asks a different question, not, "Why did I fail?" but, "What part of the system allowed this to happen?" This shifts the focus away from self-judgment and toward adjustment. For example, if you consistently miss a habit, it might not be a discipline problem. It could be a design problem. Maybe the habit is too complex, or it's placed at the wrong time of day, or it requires too many decisions. When you approach it this way, you stop blaming yourself and start refining the structure. Over time, the system becomes more aligned with how you actually function, not how you think you should function. Environment plays a larger role than most people realize. Your surroundings quietly shape your behavior in ways that often go unnoticed. If your environment is filled with distractions, your system will struggle to maintain focus. If it supports your intentions, your actions begin to feel more natural. This is why small changes in your environment can produce disproportionate results. It's not about controlling every detail, but about creating gentle cues that guide your behavior. The placement of objects, the structure of your workspace, the accessibility of certain tools, all of these things influence your decisions without requiring conscious effort. When your environment is aligned with your system, it reduces the need for constant self-control. Time also needs to be treated differently. Most people try to manage time by filling it with tasks, but a system views time as a rhythm rather than a container. It recognizes that energy fluctuates throughout the day and adjusts accordingly. Some periods are better suited for deep focus, while others are naturally lighter. Instead of forcing productivity into every moment, the system works with these natural patterns. There's a quiet acceptance in this approach. You stop fighting your own nature and start designing around it. This doesn't mean lowering your standards, it means applying them more intelligently. When your system respects your limits, it becomes easier to sustain over the long term. And then there's the question of growth. A system that never evolves eventually becomes stagnant. What worked for you at one stage of life may not work later. Responsibilities change, abandoning everything you've built. This is where reflection becomes essential. Not constant overthinking, but occasional, honest evaluation. You look at your system and ask whether it still serves you, whether it still aligns with what matters, and whether it needs refinement. This keeps the system alive, rather than turning it into a rigid set of rules. As all of this comes together, something interesting happens. The system starts to feel less like a structure you're forcing yourself into, and more like a natural extension of how you live. It supports you quietly, without demanding constant attention. It adapts when needed, holds steady when things are uncertain, and continues to guide your actions in a consistent direction. But even with a strong, flexible system in place, there's still one challenge that remains, and it's often the most subtle one. It's not about discipline, or structure, or even consistency. It's about knowing whether the system you're building is actually leading you somewhere meaningful, or simply keeping you busy. It's easy to confuse movement with meaning. When your days are structured, your habits are consistent, and your system is running smoothly, it can feel like everything is working. You're doing what you planned, staying on track, and avoiding the chaos that used to pull you in different directions. But there's a quiet question that eventually rises beneath all of that order. Is this system actually taking you where you want to go, or is it just keeping you occupied? A system can be efficient without being meaningful. It can optimize your time, sharpen your focus, and improve your output, while still drifting in a direction that doesn't truly matter to you. And this is where many people get stuck without realizing it. They build strong systems around goals they never fully examined. They become consistent in areas that don't deeply fulfill them. Over time, this creates a subtle kind of dissatisfaction, not dramatic enough to force change, but persistent enough to drain energy. To avoid this, your system needs more than structure. It needs alignment, not with external expectations, but with something internal that feels steady and real. This isn't about chasing passion in an impulsive way. It's about understanding what holds long-term meaning for you, even when excitement fades. Because excitement always fades, what remains is either a sense of quiet purpose or a growing sense of emptiness. Alignment doesn't come from a single decision. It's something you refine over time. You begin by paying attention to how different parts of your life feel when you engage with them consistently, not just in moments of success, but in the ordinary repetition of doing the work. Some activities, even when they're challenging, leave you with a sense of clarity or satisfaction. Others, no matter how productive they seem, feel draining or hollow. Your system should gradually move you toward the former and away from the latter. This doesn't require sudden, drastic changes. In fact, those often create more instability than progress. Instead, it's a process of small adjustments. You keep what feels aligned, modify what feels slightly off, and slowly remove what consistently drains you without meaningful return. There's also a need to separate external validation from internal direction. Systems built purely around approval, recognition, status, comparison, tend to become fragile over time. They depend on factors you can't fully control. When the feedback is positive, the system feels rewarding. When it disappears or turns negative, motivation drops sharply. A more stable approach is to anchor your system in values that don't shift with external opinion. This doesn't mean ignoring feedback, but it means not depending on it as your primary source of direction. When your actions are guided by something internal, consistency becomes less emotionally taxing. You're no longer constantly measuring yourself against others, you're measuring against your own standard of alignment. Another subtle challenge is the tendency to over-optimize. Once you start seeing results from your system, there's a natural urge to refine everything, to make each part more efficient, more precise, more productive. While improvement is valuable, too much optimization can strip away the human element. Your life starts to feel like a machine that needs constant tuning. A system that works well should also leave room for spontaneity, for rest, and for moments that don't serve a clear purpose. These aren't distractions, they're part of what makes the system sustainable. Without them, even the most effective structure can become exhausting. Balance isn't something you achieve once and maintain perfectly. It's something you keep adjusting, often and moving forward with intention. But over time, the goal shifts from speed to steadiness. A life system isn't meant to push you to your limits every day. It's meant to support you over years, even decades. This requires a different kind of thinking. You start asking not just, does this work, but, can I live like this for a long time? If the answer is no, the system needs to change, no matter how effective it seems in the short term. Sustainability becomes the measure of success, not intensity. And then, there's a deeper realization that often comes quietly. The system you build doesn't just shape your results, it shapes your experience of life itself. The way you structure your days determines how you feel most of the time. It influences your level of stress, your sense of control, your ability to be present. This means that building a system isn't just a practical task, it's a philosophical one. You're deciding, in a very real way, how you want to live, not in abstract terms, but in the daily reality of your actions and routines. Every adjustment you make is a reflection of what you believe matters. As this becomes clearer, the focus shifts again. It's no longer just about building a system that works, or even one that aligns. It's about building one that feels worth living inside. A system that supports not just your goals, but your well-being. One that allows you to move forward without losing yourself in the process. And yet, even with all of this in place, there's one final layer that often goes unnoticed until much later. It's not about what you do, how consistently you do it, or even why you do it. It's about what happens when you stop. There comes a moment, often unexpected, when everything slows down. It might be intentional, like taking a break, or it might be forced by circumstances, fatigue, change, loss, or simply the quiet realization that constant movement can't continue forever. And in that moment, something becomes very clear. If your entire life has been built around doing, producing, and progressing, then stopping can feel strangely uncomfortable. This is the final test of any system. Not how well it performs when everything is active and moving, but how it holds you when things become still. Many people build systems to avoid chaos, but in the process, they also avoid stillness. They fill their days so completely that there's no space left to simply exist without a task. Productivity becomes a kind of identity, and without it, there's a sense of emptiness that's hard to explain. It's not that rest is unfamiliar, it's that unstructured time feels unsettling. A well-built life system doesn't just guide your actions, it also teaches you how to be at ease when there's nothing to accomplish. It creates a relationship with stillness that feels natural instead of threatening. This doesn't happen automatically. It requires a shift in how you understand value. If all value comes from output, then stillness will always feel like a loss. But if value also comes from awareness, presence, and reflection, then stillness becomes something entirely different. It becomes a space where you can actually see your life more clearly, without the noise of constant activity. This is where the system becomes less visible but more meaningful. It's no longer just about routines or habits. It's about the internal structure you've developed, how you think, how you respond, how you relate to your own time and energy. These things don't disappear when you stop doing. They stay with you. In fact, stillness often reveals whether your system was truly supportive or simply distracting. If you feel grounded when things slow down, it means your system was built on something stable. If you feel restless or lost, it may have been holding you together more than helping you grow. There's no judgment in this, only information. Because the ability to sit with yourself, without needing constant stimulation or progress, is a form of strength that doesn't get much attention. It's quiet, but it changes how you experience everything else. Another important realization is that life doesn't move in a straight line. There are phases of expansion, where you build, explore, and push forward. And there are phases of contraction, where things become smaller, slower, and more introspective. A system that only supports expansion will eventually break under the weight of reality. Instead, it needs to accommodate both. It should allow you to move forward with clarity when energy is high, and also allow you to step back without guilt when energy is low. This balance is what makes it sustainable, not just in terms of productivity, but in terms of your overall well-being. Over time, the relationship between you and your system changes. In the beginning, it feels like something you have to manage carefully. You think about it often, adjust it frequently, and rely on it to stay on track. But as it becomes more integrated into your life, it fades into the background. You don't think about following the system anymore. You simply live in a way that reflects it. Your actions become more natural, your decisions require less effort, and your sense of direction feels more stable. The system is no longer something you use, it's something you've become. And this is where everything comes together. Not in a dramatic or final way, but in a quiet sense of coherence. Your days are structured, but not rigid. Your actions are consistent, but not forced. Your direction is clear, but not narrow. There's space to grow, to rest, to adapt, and to change. What started as an effort to gain control over your life turns into something more subtle. It becomes a way of living that doesn't require constant correction. You're no longer chasing outcomes or trying to fix yourself. You're simply participating in a structure that supports who you are and where you're going. And perhaps the most important part is this: you realize that the goal was never to build a perfect system. It was to build one that could evolve with you, hold you through different phases, and quietly guide you without taking over your life. Because in the end, a system is just a tool. What truly matters is the life it helps you experience, not just in moments of achievement, but after a while, something subtle begins to shift in the way you see everything. What once felt like effort starts to feel like rhythm. The constant tension between what you should do and what you actually do begins to fade. Not because life has become easier, but because the internal friction has reduced. You're no longer negotiating with yourself at every step. There's a quiet agreement in place. This is where the deeper benefits of a well-built life system start to reveal themselves. Not in obvious achievements or dramatic milestones, but in the quality of your everyday experience. You wake up with a clearer sense of direction, not because everything is planned perfectly, but because you trust the structure you've built. Decisions feel lighter. You spend less time overthinking small choices, and more time actually living them. There's also a growing sense of independence that comes with this. When your system is strong, you rely less on external pushes, deadlines, pressure, urgency, to get things done. You don't need a crisis to activate your focus. You don't need motivation to start moving. The system carries you forward in a steady, predictable way. This doesn't mean you become mechanical or detached. In fact, it's the opposite. Because your essential actions are supported by your system, your mind is freer to engage more deeply with the present. You're not constantly juggling unfinished tasks in your head. You're not overwhelmed by the feeling that you're falling behind. There's space to think, to notice, to be present in a way that's difficult when everything feels chaotic. Another interesting change is how you relate to progress. In the beginning, progress often feels like something you need to prove, to yourself or to others. You look for visible signs that what you're doing is working. But as your system stabilizes, your relationship with progress becomes quieter. You don't need constant confirmation. You trust that the direction is right, even when the results aren't immediately visible. This kind of trust isn't blind. It's built from experience. You've seen how small, consistent actions accumulate over time. You've seen how staying with the process, even when it feels slow, eventually leads to meaningful change. That understanding becomes a kind of anchor. It keeps you steady during periods where nothing seems to be happening on the surface. There's also a shift in how you handle uncertainty. Life doesn't become more predictable just because you've built a system. Unexpected things still happen. Plans still change. But your response to those moments is different. Instead of feeling completely thrown off, you adjust. The system gives you a base to return to, even when things temporarily fall apart. This resilience is not about avoiding difficulty. It's about recovering more quickly when difficulty arises. You don't spend as much time stuck in disruption. You find your way back to your rhythm faster, because that rhythm is no longer fragile. Relationships also begin to change in subtle ways. When your life has more structure and clarity, your interactions with others often become more intentional. You're less reactive, less rushed, and more present. You listen more carefully. You respond more thoughtfully. This doesn't come from trying to be better in social situations, but from having less internal noise competing for your attention. At the same time, you may notice that certain relationships naturally shift or fade. Not because of conflict, but because your direction has become clearer. You're less drawn to environments or conversations that pull you away from what matters. This isn't about becoming distant or disconnected. It's about becoming more aligned with how you choose to spend your time and energy. There's also a deeper sense of ownership that develops. You stop feeling like life is something that happens to you, and start experiencing it as something you're actively shaping. Even when things don't go as planned, you don't feel powerless. You see where adjustments can be made. You understand your role in the process. And yet, with all of this growth, there's an important balance to maintain. As your system becomes more effective, there's always a risk of becoming too attached to it. You might start to see it as something that must be protected at all costs. Any disruption can feel like a threat. Any deviation can feel like failure. This is where awareness becomes essential again. The system is there to serve you, not the other way around. If it ever starts to feel restrictive or heavy, that's a signal to step back and reassess. The strength of a system is not in how rigidly it's followed, but in how well it adapts without losing its core purpose. Over time, you begin to understand priorities, a different way of approaching your day. These are the things that keep the system alive and responsive. And as this continues, life starts to feel less like a series of problems to solve and more like something to navigate. You're still working toward things, still improving, still growing, but there's less strain in the process, less urgency to prove something, more space to experience what's already here. Eventually, you reach a point where the question is no longer, how do I build a better system? It becomes something quieter, but more profound. How do I live well within the system I've already built? And that question doesn't lead to more structure. It leads to a different kind of understanding altogether. There's a quiet maturity that begins to take shape when you stop trying to constantly improve everything. Not because growth has lost its value, but because you start to see that endless optimization can become its own kind of distraction. The system you've built is no longer fragile. It works. It supports you. And now, the focus shifts from building and refining to something more subtle, living with awareness inside what already exists. At this stage, the biggest changes are no longer external. They're internal, almost invisible to anyone else. The way you move through your day feels different. There's less resistance, less second guessing. You don't feel the need to constantly evaluate whether you're doing enough. That question slowly loses its grip, replaced by something steadier, a sense that you are engaged with your life in a way that feels real. This doesn't mean everything becomes perfect or easy. There are still difficult days, moments of doubt, periods where your energy drops or your focus drifts. But these moments no longer carry the same weight. They don't immediately turn into self-criticism or a need to fix everything. Instead, they pass through more naturally, without disrupting the entire structure you've built. One of the most important shifts here is how you relate to time. Earlier, time may have felt like something to manage tightly, something that could slip away if you weren't careful. Now, it begins to feel more like something you move with rather than against. You still respect it, but you're not constantly chasing it. There's a rhythm to your days that feels sustainable, not forced. You start to notice things you used to overlook. Small details, quiet moments, the spaces between tasks. These moments don't feel like interruptions anymore. They feel like part of the experience. And in a way, this is where much of life actually happens, not in the big achievements, but in the ordinary flow that surrounds them. There's also a deeper sense of trust that develops, not just in your system, but in yourself. You trust that you'll handle what comes, even if you don't have everything planned. You trust that you can adjust when needed, that you can recover from setbacks, that you don't need to control every outcome to stay on track. This trust reduces a lot of the underlying tension that people carry without realizing it. The constant need to be certain, to have everything figured out, begins to soften. You become more comfortable with not knowing, with allowing things to unfold without forcing them into a rigid structure. At the same time, your sense of responsibility doesn't disappear. If anything, it becomes more grounded. You're still committed to your actions, still aware of the direction you're moving in. But that commitment feels less like pressure and more like a natural extension of who you are. There's also a change in how you define success. Earlier, it might have been tied to clear outcomes, results you could measure and point to. Now, it becomes more about the quality of your engagement. How present you are, how aligned your actions feel, how sustainable your pace is. Success becomes something you experience internally, not just something you achieve externally. This shift has a calming effect. It removes the constant comparison, the need to measure yourself against others or against an imagined ideal. You're still aware of the world around you, but you're not constantly reacting to it. Your direction feels self-contained. And yet, there's an interesting paradox here. As you become more settled, more consistent, more at ease within your system, there's a risk of becoming too comfortable. Not in a negative way, but in a way that can slowly limit growth if you're not paying attention. Comfort can quietly turn into stagnation if there's no awareness guiding it. This doesn't mean you need to constantly push yourself into discomfort, but it does mean staying open. Open to change, to new perspectives, to the possibility that your system might need to evolve again. Your established patterns to see if they still serve you. Sometimes, this means letting go of parts of your system that once felt essential. Not because they were wrong, but because you've outgrown them. This can feel strange at first. There's a natural tendency to hold on to what has worked. But part of living well is knowing when to release something, even if it once played an important role. As this continues, life begins to feel less like something you're trying to control and more like something you're participating in. You're still intentional, still aware, still moving forward. But there's less force in it, more flow. And in that flow, you begin to see something clearly that may not have been obvious before. The system was never the destination. It was a bridge. A way to move from confusion to clarity, from inconsistency to stability, from reaction to intention. And once you've crossed that bridge, the question changes one final time. Not about what you should do next, or how you should improve, but about how fully you're willing to experience the life that's already in front of you. At a certain point, the need to keep asking questions begins to fade. Not because you've found all the answers, but because you've stopped looking for life to behave in a perfectly understandable way. There's a quiet acceptance that replaces the constant search for clarity. You still think, still reflect, still adjust, but it no longer feels like you're trying to solve something all the time. What you begin to notice instead is how much of life was always available to you, but hidden beneath urgency, distraction, and the pressure to become something else. The system you built helped you clear that noise. It gave you structure when you needed direction, discipline when you needed stability, and consistency when everything felt scattered. But now, standing on the other side of that effort, something softer comes into view. You start to experience moments without immediately trying to use them. A walk doesn't need to be productive. A conversation doesn't need to lead somewhere. Even your own thoughts don't always need to be analyzed or improved. There's a kind of ease in allowing things to exist without turning them into tasks. This doesn't make you passive. You're still engaged, still moving, still building where it matters. But the intensity has changed. There's less pressure behind your actions. You're no longer trying to extract value from every moment. And strangely, this is where life begins to feel more valuable. Because when everything is treated as a means to an end, you miss the experience itself. The system helped you move forward, but now it also allows you to slow down without guilt. That balance is rare. Most people swing between chaos and control, never quite finding a space where both structure and freedom can exist together. You've begun to build that space. And within it, your relationship with yourself changes in a way that's hard to describe but easy to feel. There's less internal conflict. Less of that constant tension between what you are and what you think you should be. You're still growing, but you're not rejecting your current state in the process. This creates a kind of stability that doesn't depend on circumstances. Good days don't make you overly attached, and difficult days don't completely throw you off. There's a steadiness underneath both. Not indifference, but balance. You also start to see other people differently. When you're no longer caught in your own constant striving, you become more aware of how others are moving through their lives. You notice their patterns, their struggles, their systems, whether they realize it or not. And instead of judging or comparing, there's more understanding. Everyone is operating within some kind of structure, even if it's unintentional. Some are trapped in cycles they don't recognize. Others are trying to force change without adjusting the foundation beneath their actions. And a few are quietly building something that supports them, even if it's not visible from the outside. This awareness doesn't make you superior. If anything, it makes you more patient. You understand how long it takes to see clearly, and how easy it is to fall back into old patterns. So instead of trying to fix others or prove something, you simply live in a way that reflects what you've learned. There's a kind of influence in that, but it's not loud. It doesn't come from advice or explanation. It comes from consistency, from presence, from the way you carry yourself through ordinary moments. And yet, even here, there's something important to remember. This isn't a final state. It's not a place where everything is complete. Life doesn't really offer that kind of closure. There will still be changes, more awareness. Continuing with a deeper understanding of what matters and what doesn't. Continuing with a system that is no longer rigid, but responsive. No longer something you rely on blindly, but something you've integrated into the way you live. And maybe that's the most meaningful shift of all. You're no longer trying to build a life. You're living one. Not perfectly, not completely figured out, but consciously. With enough structure to stay grounded, and enough openness to stay human. And in that balance, something settles. Not as a final answer, but as a quiet sense that you're no longer lost in the process. You're part of it. In the end, what remains isn't the system itself, but the way it has quietly reshaped how you see and move through life. What once required effort, discipline, and constant attention has become something more natural, almost unnoticeable. The structure is still there, but it no longer feels like a structure. It feels like a rhythm you've grown into. You no longer wake up thinking about what you need to fix. That urgency, that subtle sense that something is always missing or incomplete, has softened. Not because everything is perfect, but because you've stopped measuring your life against an endless list of expectations. There's a quiet confidence in knowing that you're showing up, that you're engaged, and that you're moving in a direction that feels honest. And honesty becomes more important than perfection. You start to recognize when something feels off, not as a failure, but as a signal. A small misalignment, a shift in energy, a sense that something needs attention. Instead of ignoring it or overreacting, you adjust. Sometimes the adjustment is small, a change in pace, a moment of rest, a slight shift in focus. Other times, it's larger, letting go of something that no longer fits, even if it once did. There's a kind of quiet courage in that. Letting go is often harder than building. It requires you to trust that what you've learned will carry forward, even if the structure changes. And over time, you begin to see that nothing is really wasted. Every system you built, every habit you practiced, every phase you moved through, it all shaped the way you understand yourself now. That understanding becomes your foundation, more than any specific routine or method. You also begin to notice how little you need to feel grounded. Where you once depended on detailed plans or strict structures, you now rely more on awareness. You can sense when you're drifting too far, when your attention is scattered, when your energy is being pulled in too many directions. And instead of needing a complete reset, you make small corrections. This makes life feel lighter. Not easier in the sense that challenges disappear, but less heavy in how you carry them. You don't accumulate as much mental weight. You deal with things as they come, with a steadiness that wasn't there before. There's also a growing appreciation for simplicity. Not forced minimalism, but a natural movement away from unnecessary complexity. You realize that many of the things you once thought were essential were actually adding noise. As your system evolved, it filtered those things out, leaving behind what truly matters. And what remains is often surprisingly simple. A few core actions that keep you grounded. A few priorities that guide your decisions. A way of thinking that helps you navigate uncertainty without becoming overwhelmed. It's not a complicated framework. It's something you can carry with you anywhere, without needing to constantly refer back to rules or plans. This simplicity creates space. Space to think, to feel, to notice. Space to respond instead of react. Space to experience life without always trying to control it. And in that space, something else becomes possible, a deeper kind of presence. Not the kind that comes from forcing yourself to be in the moment, but the kind that emerges when your mind isn't pulled in 100 different directions. You're here, in what you're doing, without constantly jumping ahead or looking back. There's a sense of completeness in each moment, even if it's ordinary. This changes how you experience time. It no longer feels like something slipping away or something you need to chase. It feels more like something you're moving through, steadily and consciously. The urgency that once drove you has been replaced by something calmer, but not weaker, more sustainable, more real. And perhaps the most important realization is this: there was never a final version of you waiting at the end of all this effort. No perfect state where everything is resolved, where every habit is flawless, where every day feels exactly right. What you've built isn't a finished life. It's a way of living you completely, and that distinction matters. Because when a system defines you, you become rigid. But when it supports you, you remain free. Free to change your mind. Free to explore new directions. Free to step away and return without feeling like you've lost everything. Free to be a person, not a process. In the end, that's what all of this was leading toward. Not control, not perfection, not even constant growth, but a kind of quiet stability that allows you to live fully, without needing to hold everything together so tightly. And when you reach that point, there's nothing left to build in the same way as before. Only something to continue. Something to live. Something that no longer needs a name, a system, or a structure to prove that it works. Because you can feel it, in the way you move, the way you think, and the way you experience each day. And that feeling, steady and unforced, is enough. And even after all of this, life doesn't settle into a fixed pattern. It keeps moving, quietly changing in ways you don't always notice at first. New responsibilities appear, priorities shift, certain things that once felt important begin to fade, and others take their place. What's different now is not that change has stopped, but that it no longer feels disruptive in the same way. You're not starting from zero each time something changes. There's a kind of continuity that stays with you. Because what you've built was never just about routines or habits. It was about understanding how to adjust without losing yourself in the process. So when life shifts, and it always does, you don't react with urgency or panic. You observe first. You let things settle. Then, slowly, you begin to realign. This ability to realign is quiet, but it changes everything. It means you don't cling to outdated versions of your life just because they once worked. You don't force old systems onto new circumstances. Instead, you allow your structure to evolve, just as you have. There's less resistance in letting go, and more clarity in starting again, not from scratch, but from experience. You begin to trust transitions. Where once they may have felt like interruptions, now they feel like a natural part of the process. Not comfortable, always, but familiar in a deeper sense. You understand that every phase has its own rhythm, its own demands, its own lessons. And instead of trying to make everything consistent all the time, you adapt to what each phase requires. This makes you more responsive to life, rather than rigid within it. There's also a noticeable shift in how you handle uncertainty about the future. Earlier, there may have been a need to define things clearly, to know where you were going, what the outcome would be, how everything would unfold. Now, that need softens. You still have direction, but you don't need every detail in advance. You've seen enough to know that clarity often comes through movement, not before it. So you move, not recklessly, but with a kind of grounded openness. You take steps without needing guarantees. You allow space for things to develop, to reveal themselves over time. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you adaptable. And adaptability, over the long term, is far more valuable than rigid certainty. There's also a deeper relationship with patience that forms here. Not the forced kind, where you're waiting for something to happen, but a more natural patience that comes from understanding how things unfold. You no longer expect immediate results from meaningful efforts. You've seen how long it takes for real change to take root, so you give things time. Not endlessly, not without awareness, but without unnecessary pressure. You stay engaged, you continue showing up, but you're not constantly checking for progress. You allow the process to breathe. This creates a different kind of confidence. One that isn't loud or dependent on visible success, but steady and internal. You know that you're moving in a direction that makes sense for you, even if it doesn't look impressive from the outside. And that's enough. At the same time, there's an increasing clarity about what doesn't matter. Not in a dismissive way, but in a grounded, practical sense. You stop giving energy to things that don't align with your direction. You become more selective, not because you're trying to control everything, but because you understand the cost of attention. Your time, your focus, your energy, these are no longer things you spend casually. And this selectiveness creates more depth in the areas you choose to engage with. Instead of being spread thin, you're more present in fewer things. And that presence leads to a different kind of satisfaction. Not the quick, surface, level kind, but something more. When awareness required effort, when you had to remind yourself to stay on track, to follow your system, to make the right choices. Now, much of that happens naturally. Not perfectly, but consistently enough that it doesn't require your full attention. This frees up something important. Your mind is no longer occupied with managing yourself all the time. It has space to explore, to create, to simply be curious again. And that curiosity brings a different kind of richness into your life, one that isn't tied to productivity or outcomes. You start to engage with things not because they are useful, but because they are interesting. Not because they lead somewhere, but because they add something to your experience. And in a quiet way, this brings you full circle, because in the beginning, the focus was on building something, creating structure, gaining control, moving toward a better version of life. And now, without losing any of that structure, you've returned to a place where life feels open again. Not chaotic, not directionless, but open. Open enough to grow, open enough to change, open enough to experience things without needing to immediately define them. And maybe that's what all of this was really about. Not building a perfect system, but building a life that doesn't close in on itself. A life that remains flexible, aware, and quietly alive. There's a quiet point you reach where nothing feels like it needs to be added anymore. Not because life has stopped offering opportunities, but because the constant urge to add, improve, and expand has softened into something more deliberate. You are no longer collecting habits, strategies, or systems in the hope that one of them will finally complete the picture. You've already seen enough to understand that the picture was never meant to be completed. It was meant to be lived. And this realization changes the way you relate to everything going forward. You still build when it makes sense. You still adjust when something feels off. But there's no longer that underlying tension, the sense that you are always behind, always catching up, always trying to reach a version of life that exists somewhere ahead of you. Instead, there's a quiet sense of being where you are. Not stuck, not settled in a limiting way, but present in a way that feels grounded. You are aware of your direction, but you are not rushing toward it. You are engaged in your life, but not overwhelmed by it. There's space between your actions, and in that space, there's clarity. You begin to trust that not everything needs to be optimized. Some things can simply be experienced as they are. A day doesn't have to be perfectly structured to be meaningful. A moment doesn't have to be productive to have value. You stop filtering every experience through the question of whether it's useful, and start allowing things to exist without justification. This doesn't make you less effective. If anything, it makes your actions more precise. Because when you do choose to focus, it's intentional. It's not driven by anxiety or habit, but by clarity. You are not doing things just to stay busy. You are doing them because they align with where you are and where you are going. There's also a deeper sense of closure, not in the sense of an ending, but in the sense of completeness within each phase. You are less likely to carry unfinished mental weight from one part of your life into another. When something ends, you allow it to end. When something changes, you adjust without holding on to how things used to be. This creates a kind of mental lightness that's hard to describe until you feel it. You are not constantly revisiting the past or overanalyzing what's ahead. You are here, dealing with what's in front of you, with enough awareness to respond thoughtfully, but without unnecessary complexity. And in that simplicity, there's a kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to prove itself. You don't feel the need to explain your path to everyone. You don't feel the need to compare it constantly with others. You understand that different lives move at different paces, in different directions, with different priorities. And instead of questioning that, you accept it. This acceptance doesn't make you passive. It makes you steady. Because when you are no longer pulled in multiple directions by external expectations, your energy becomes more focused. You are able to commit more fully to what matters, not because you are forcing yourself to, but because there's less distraction competing for your attention. There's also a deeper appreciation for the ordinary. Things that once felt routine or even dull begin to take on a different quality. Not because they've changed, but because you have. You are more present, more aware, more engaged with what's actually happening instead of constantly looking for what's next. And strangely, this is where a lot of fulfillment begins to live. Not in big moments or major achievements, but in the consistency of everyday experience. In the way you move through your day, in the way you handle small decisions, in the way you respond to things that don't go as planned. All of it adds up, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, reliable one. And as this becomes clearer, something else quietly falls away. The need to constantly define your life in terms of progress. You are still moving forward, but you are not measuring every step. You are not turning your life into a continuous evaluation. You are living it. And that distinction, while subtle, changes everything. Because when life stops being something you are trying to manage perfectly, it becomes something you can actually experience fully. You are still aware, still intentional, still grounded in the structure you've built. But you are not confined by it. You can step outside of it when needed. You can return to it when it helps. You can reshape it when it no longer fits. It's no longer something you depend on completely. It's something you carry lightly. And maybe that's the final shift. The system that once felt so important, so necessary, so central to everything, you no longer need to think about it in the same way. Isn't the system itself, but the way it changed you, the way you think, the way you choose, the way you live. And in that, there's nothing left to build in the old sense. Only something to continue, quietly and consistently, without pressure. A life that doesn't need constant fixing. A life that doesn't need constant proving. A life that simply moves forward, one day at a time, with a sense of direction that feels both steady and free. There's a point, almost unnoticed, where you stop trying to hold everything together. Not because you've given up, but because you've realized that life was never asking to be controlled that tightly in the first place. The effort you once used to manage every detail, every outcome, every possibility, it begins to feel unnecessary. Not wrong, just no longer needed in the same way. What replaces it isn't carelessness. It's a quieter form of attention. You're still aware of your choices. You still notice when things drift, when something needs adjusting, when your energy is being pulled in directions that don't feel right, but you respond differently now. There's less urgency in your reaction, less pressure to immediately correct everything. You allow things to breathe. And in doing that, you start to see more clearly. Because when you're not constantly interfering, patterns become easier to recognize. You notice what naturally holds and what consistently falls apart. You see where effort creates results, and where it only creates tension. This kind of awareness doesn't come from forcing clarity, it comes from giving yourself enough space to actually observe your life as it unfolds. There's a kind of intelligence in that space. Not analytical, not overly structured, but intuitive in a grounded way. You begin to trust your sense of timing more. When to act, when to wait, when to step in, and when to let things play out a little longer. This isn't something you calculate step by step. It's something you feel, built from everything you've experienced so far. And this changes how you make decisions. They become less about finding the perfect answer and more about choosing a direction that feels aligned, then adjusting as you go. You're no longer stuck in hesitation, trying to predict every outcome before you move. You understand that clarity often follows action, not the other way around. So you move. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but with a kind of quiet confidence that you'll handle what comes next. There's also less fear around making the wrong choice. Not because mistakes have disappeared, but because they've lost their weight. You've seen enough to know that most paths, even the imperfect ones, lead to something useful. They teach you, adjust you, refine your understanding. And because of that, you're less afraid to step forward. This creates momentum, but a different kind than before. Earlier, momentum may have felt like constant motion, always doing, always progressing, always pushing forward. Now, it feels more like continuity. A steady movement that doesn't require force. You're not trying to accelerate all the time. You're simply continuing, without unnecessary interruption. There's also a noticeable shift in how you relate to control. You still care about outcomes. You still put effort into what matters. But you no longer expect to control everything. You've seen how unpredictable life can be, how quickly things can change, how many variables are outside your influence. And instead of resisting that, you've made space for it. This doesn't weaken your system, it strengthens it. Because a system that depends on control is always under pressure. A system that allows for uncertainty has room to adapt. It doesn't break as easily. It adjusts, recalibrates, and keeps moving. At the same time, your sense of responsibility becomes more precise. You stop taking responsibility for things that were never yours to carry. Other people's expectations, outcomes you can't fully control, situations that extend beyond your influence. You begin to see these more clearly. And in doing so, you free up energy to focus on what is actually within your reach. Your actions become cleaner. Less scattered, less reactive, more intentional. And this clarity extends into how you experience success and failure. Success no longer inflates your sense of self in the same way. It's appreciated, but it doesn't define you. And failure doesn't reduce you. It's processed, understood, and then integrated without turning into something heavier than it needs to be. There's a balance here that feels steady. You're engaged, but not attached in a way that destabilizes you. You care, but not in a way that consumes you. And this balance makes it easier to keep going, even when things aren't ideal. Because, to meet those changes, you adapt from a place that already feels grounded. You don't start over. You continue. And in that continuation, something becomes very clear. You were never trying to build a perfect system. You were learning how to live without needing one to hold you together. The system helped you get here. It gave you structure when you needed it, direction when you were unsure, stability when things felt scattered. But now, what holds you isn't the system. It's your understanding, your awareness, your ability to move through life without constantly losing your footing. And that's not something you can reduce to a set of rules or routines. It's something you carry with you, quietly, in the way you think, act, and respond. something that doesn't need to be maintained in the same way, something that simply stays. And from here, there isn't really a next step in the way there used to be. No new system to build, no major shift to chase, just a continued unfolding, a life that moves, changes, and evolves, while you remain steady within it, not fixed, not finished, but no longer searching in the same way. And that, more than anything else, is what changes how everything feels. And after everything settles into this quieter, steadier way of living, there's one last shift that happens, so subtle that you might miss it if you are not paying attention. You stop trying to turn your life into a concept. For a long time, there was a need to understand everything, to organize it, define it, improve it, explain it. You built systems, refined them, questioned them, and evolved through them, and all of that had its place. It helped you move from confusion to clarity, from scattered effort to intentional action. But now, there's less need to constantly interpret your life while you are living it. You don't have to step outside of every experience to analyze it. You don't have to label every phase or measure every change. There's a quiet permission to simply be inside your life, without turning it into something you need to manage or explain. And this changes the texture of everything. Moments feel more direct, less filtered, less processed. You are not thinking about whether something is meaningful, you are experiencing whether it is. And that experience is enough. It doesn't need to be expanded into a lesson or reduced into a system. There's a kind of honesty in that. Because when you stop trying to shape every moment into something useful, you begin to see things more clearly as they are. Some days feel focused, others feel slow. Some moments are engaging, others are quiet or even empty. But none of it feels like a problem that needs to be solved immediately. It's just part of the movement. And for the first time, you are not trying to control that movement in the same way. You are participating in it. This doesn't mean you've lost direction. If anything, your direction feels more stable than ever. But it's no longer something you have to constantly think about. It's there in the background, guiding you without demanding your full attention. You know what matters, not in a rigid, fixed way, but in a way that feels flexible and alive. You can adjust when needed, but you don't question everything all the time. There's less doubt, not because you've eliminated uncertainty, but because you've learned how to exist alongside it. There's also a quiet sense of completion, not of your life as a whole, but of a certain phase of it. The phase where you were searching intensely, where you were trying to figure things out, to build something stable, to create a way of living that made sense. That phase has done its work. And now, what follows is not another phase of building in the same way, but a phase of living with what you've already built. Not perfectly, not without adjustments, but without that same urgency to constantly improve everything. There's a kind of peace in that. Not the kind that removes all challenges or questions, but the kind that allows those things to exist without overwhelming you. You can face difficulty without feeling lost. You can experience uncertainty without needing immediate answers. You've become more comfortable in the space between knowing and not knowing. And that space, once uncomfortable, now feels natural, even necessary, because it's where life actually unfolds, not in certainty, but in movement. As this becomes clearer, there's less need to look for a final conclusion. You are no longer asking, what does it all lead to, in the same way, not because the question is wrong, but because it no longer holds the same weight. You are already in it. Whatever this is, this experience, this movement, this unfolding, it's not something happening later. It becomes quieter, more natural, less forced. It happens when it needs to, not because you're constantly searching for something. And in that quiet, something settles fully. Not as an idea, not as a conclusion, but as a way of being. You're here, aware, but not overthinking. Structured, but not restricted. Moving forward, but not rushing. There's nothing you need to prove, nothing you need to finalize, nothing you need to turn into something more than it already is. And strangely, that's where everything starts to feel complete, not because it is finished, but because it no longer needs to be. The system, the structure, the effort, the questions, all of it brought you here. To a place where life is no longer something you're trying to build or solve. It's something you're living, quietly, fully, and without the need to turn it into anything else. And in this place where nothing needs to be added, fixed, or explained, something else quietly becomes clear. Life continues, but your relationship with it has fundamentally changed. You're no longer standing outside of your own experience, evaluating it as it happens. That distance, which once felt necessary for growth, has dissolved. You're not watching your life unfold like a project that needs constant improvement. You're inside it now, fully present in a way that doesn't require effort. There's no ongoing attempt to optimize your thoughts, no subtle pressure to turn every feeling into insight. Even growth itself begins to feel different. It's no longer something you chase or measure. It happens naturally, as a byproduct of living with awareness. And because of that, it doesn't feel heavy. It doesn't feel like work. It feels like something that unfolds on its own, as long as you stay connected to what's real in front of you. This creates a kind of ease that's difficult to describe unless you've experienced the opposite for a long time. The constant mental movement, the analyzing, adjusting, questioning, it quiets down. Not completely, but enough that it no longer dominates your attention. There's more silence in your mind. Not emptiness, but space. Space for things to arise and pass without being immediately controlled or reshaped. Space to notice without reacting. Space to experience without needing to interfere. And in that space, life feels closer, more direct, less filtered through layers of interpretation. You begin to trust that you don't need to constantly guide everything, that your awareness, on its own, is often enough. That when something truly needs your attention, it will become clear without force. This trust is quiet, but it runs deep. It removes a kind of background tension you may not have even realized you were carrying, the feeling that if you're not actively managing everything, things might fall apart. Now, you see that they don't. Or if they do, you'll handle it when it happens. There's no need to prepare for every possibility in advance. You've become responsive rather than preemptive, and that shift changes how you move through uncertainty. You don't brace yourself in the same way. You don't try to predict every outcome. You allow things to unfold, and you meet them as they come. This doesn't make life predictable. It makes you stable within it. There's a difference. Because stability isn't about controlling what happens, it's about not losing yourself when it does. And that's what you've built. Not a perfect system, not an unbreakable routine, but a way of being that stays intact, even when circumstances change. And from here, something else gently fades, the need to arrive somewhere. For so long, there may have been a sense that you were moving toward a final point. A place where everything would make sense, where you would feel complete, where nothing would need to change anymore. But now, that idea feels less relevant. Not disappointing, just unnecessary. Because what you were looking for in that imagined future is already present in a quieter form. In the way you move through your days, in the way you handle your thoughts, in the way you respond to life without constant resistance. There's nothing missing in the way there used to be. There's still movement, still change, still growth, but not from a place of lack. From a place of continuity. And this continuity has a certain calmness to it. You're not rushing towards something. You're not trying to escape where you are. You're simply moving, as life moves, with a sense of awareness that doesn't need to be forced. Even your ambitions, if they exist, feel different. They're not driven by urgency or comparison. They come from a quieter place. A place that doesn't need to prove anything. A place that allows you to build, create, and feeling like everything depends on it. You can care deeply without being consumed. You can move forward without needing guarantees. And in that, life opens up again. Not as something to figure out, but as something to experience, moment by moment, without needing to hold it too tightly. There's nothing left to summarize, nothing left to conclude, because what you've arrived at isn't an idea. It's a way of being that doesn't need explanation. And from here, life doesn't ask you to build another system, or reach another level, or find another answer. It simply continues. And now, so do you. Not searching, not striving in the same way. Just living, with a clarity that no longer needs to be constantly questioned. And that quiet, steady clarity, more than anything else, is enough. And when everything becomes this quiet, this steady, something almost unexpected begins to happen. You stop noticing yourself so much. For a long time, there was a kind of self-awareness that followed you everywhere. You were observing your habits, your thoughts, your progress, your direction. You were checking, adjusting, refining. And that awareness was useful. It helped you grow, helped you build something stable, helped you understand how you move through life. But now, that constant self-observation fades into the background. You're not thinking about yourself all the time anymore. You're just living. There's a lightness in that which's hard to describe until it happens. The mind is no longer looping back on itself, trying to evaluate every action or interpret every feeling. You're not asking, "Am I doing this right?" in the same way. That question has lost its urgency, not because you have all the answers, but because you no longer need them in the same form. You trust the way you move. You trust the way you respond. You trust that if something is off, you'll notice it, not through constant monitoring, but through a natural sense of awareness that doesn't require effort. And because of that, your attention begins to shift outward, toward what's actually in front of you, toward the people you're with, the work you're doing, the environment you're in, the moment you're experiencing. There's less distraction from your own internal noise, and more connection to what's real and immediate. This creates a different kind of depth. Conversations feel more present. Work feels more focused. Even simple moments, walking, sitting, thinking, feel more complete, because they're not being interrupted by constant internal commentary. There's also a noticeable absence of something that used to feel normal, the pressure to become. For so long, there may have been a sense that you were in the process of becoming someone more disciplined, more successful, more aligned, more complete. And while that process had value, it also carried a kind of subtle tension, as if who you were right now was always slightly insufficient. That tension is gone. Not because you've stopped growing, but because growth is no longer tied to that sense of lack. You're not becoming in order to fix yourself. You're simply evolving as part of living. And that distinction changes how everything feels. There's more ease in your actions, because they're not driven by the need to correct something about yourself. There's more patience in your progress, because you're not racing toward a version of yourself that feels far away. You're already here, and that's enough to move forward from. There's also a deeper sense of quiet confidence that doesn't need reinforcement. It's not something you think about often, and it doesn't depend on outcomes or validation. It's just there, in the background, supporting you without drawing attention to itself. You don't need to remind yourself to stay on track. You are on track, in a way that feels natural. And even when you drift slightly, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like part of the movement. You adjust without turning it into something bigger than it is. This simplicity extends into how you see the future. There's still direction, still intention, but not the same level of projection. You're not constantly imagining what things will look like months or years from now. You're more focused on what's unfolding now, trusting that the future will shape itself through your continued presence and action. This doesn't mean you've lost ambition. It means your ambition has become quieter, more grounded. Less about reaching, more about expressing. Less about proving, more about building in a way that feels true. And because of that, there's less conflict between where you are and where you're going. They feel connected, not separate. There's no sense that you need to escape your current life to reach you're fully inside your own, not analyzing it from a distance, not constantly reshaping it, not trying to turn it into something else, just living it, directly, with a kind of steady awareness that doesn't need to be forced. And in that, something very simple, but very real, becomes clear. There was never a final system to build. Only a way to arrive here, where nothing extra is needed, and nothing essential is missing. And when you reach this point, there's almost nothing left to say in the way there used to be. Not because life has become empty, but because it has become direct. There's no longer a need to translate everything into words, frameworks, or ideas just to understand it. Experience stands on its own. A moment is simply a moment. A decision is simply a decision. You don't feel the need to step outside of it and explain it to yourself while it's happening. You've stepped out of that constant layer of interpretation. And what remains is something quieter, but more real. You wake up, and the day begins, not as something to manage or optimize, but as something to move through. There are things you'll do, things you'll respond to, things you'll experience. Some planned, some unexpected. And instead of trying to control how all of it unfolds, you meet it as it comes. There's a steadiness in that. Not rigid, not fixed, but reliable in a way that doesn't need to announce itself. You don't have to prepare yourself mentally for every part of the day. You don't have to rehearse how you'll handle things. You trust that when something happens, you'll respond. And you do, naturally, without turning it into a process. This doesn't mean you've lost thoughtfulness or depth. It means those things have become integrated. You're not trying to be aware, you are aware. You're not trying to be disciplined, you act in ways that reflect it. You're not trying to stay aligned. You move in that direction without constant effort. The effort has dissolved into the way you live. And because of that, there's more energy available for what's actually in front of you. You're less divided, less pulled between thinking and doing, less caught between planning and experiencing. There's a kind of unity in your attention. When you're doing something, you're there. When you're resting, you're resting. When you're thinking, without that extra layer of pressure to make every thought useful or productive. This simplicity isn't something you forced. It emerged as everything unnecessary slowly fell away. And what's left is something you can rely on without needing to constantly check it. There's also a quiet sense of enoughness that settles in, not in a way that stops you from moving forward, but in a way that removes the feeling that something is missing. You're not operating from a gap that needs to be filled. You're operating from a place that already feels whole, even as it continues to change. This changes your relationship with effort. You still put in effort where it matters. You still care about what you're building, what you're contributing, what you're experiencing, but the effort is clean. It's not mixed with anxiety, or pressure, or the need to prove something. It's simply directed. And because of that, it's more effective, even if it doesn't feel as intense. There's also less attachment to outcomes in the way there used to be. You still have preferences. You still aim for certain results. But your sense of stability doesn't depend on whether those results happen exactly as expected. You've seen enough to know that life rarely follows a straight path. And more importantly, you've learned how to move within that unpredictability without losing your balance. So when things go well, you appreciate it without holding on too tightly. And when things don't, you adjust without turning it into something overwhelming. This balance doesn't come from controlling your reactions. It comes from no longer being completely defined by them. And in that, there's a kind of freedom that isn't loud or dramatic, but deeply steady. You can move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. You can engage without overcommitting your identity to what you're doing. You can care without becoming consumed. And maybe the most important part of all this is how natural it feels. There's no sense that you've arrived somewhere special. No feeling that you've unlocked a final level. It just feels like you've returned to something simple. Something that was always there, but hidden under layers of noise, pressure, and constant effort. And now, without those layers, life feels clearer. Not easier in every way, but more direct. More honest. More livable. There's nothing left to build in the way you once thought. Movement, quiet and unforced, everything you were trying to create through systems, habits, and structure is already present. Not as an idea, not as a goal, but as the way you live now, without needing to call it anything at all.